All right, well, we're going to be talking about how to translate your UX skill sets into a interfaceless kind of world. So that will kind of revolve around user experience design for voice-based platforms, tools, devices, and I'll kind of walk through that process here. So really what we're going to cover is what does interfaceless mean? How do we design for it? What are we looking at? What UX skills are needed? And then why should a designer care about this? So first, a little bit about me. I'm a founder of an agency that's local here called Keval. We specialize in user experience design. We build things from kind of interfaces that are desktop mobile-based all the way down to mobile apps and then voice-based skill sets. So for devices like Alexa, Google Home, Siri, and we'll talk about how we incorporate that in. So the first question is basically, what do we mean by interfaceless? So it's really kind of a multifaceted way of communicating with the user. So we have devices like our traditional interfaces that are web-based or mobile-based. What we're doing on this type of device is to work with interfaces that don't have a screen. So rather they be motion sensors like home security systems or tools like that, or voice-based interfaces. So things like the Google Home that's displayed here, or CarPlay and things like that. So to kind of start off, I'll go through like a historical track of how these became a thing, and then we'll jump into kind of figuring out what and how we operate the user experience cycle on design. So kind of early on in the 50s, there's a system called Audrey that was created by Bell Labs. What that basically did was understand a set of numbers. So instead of dialing a 10-digit phone number, an operator at a phone system can just speak it, and it picked it up and it translated. Very limited functionality, but a pretty big breakthrough for voice recognition by devices. Then a couple years after, IBM invented Shoebox, which is basically the understanding of text. So it was programmed to understand about 30 words, like call the hospital or call the local library, and then that kind of evolved into the next generation, which was automated attendance. So everyone's probably used this, kind of going through various kind of phone calls or services, press 1 for sales or 2 for support. And that process really is now evolved into something much more, which is what we end up in the modern day is called IVRs. So these kind of interactive voice responses are really around the ability to communicate intelligently with the phone system. So it saves costs on the business side, and it experiences customer satisfaction. So an example would be calling United Airlines. When you call them, it looks up your caller ID, picks up the flight that you have upcoming, and then based on the flight, it'll tell you data like, oh, it's delayed, or there's a snowstorm, and it's all kind of programmed through user experience. Based on what the user speaks to, it outputs how the system should behave. A lot of other use cases for this, like e-purchasing through mobile purchases in the e-commerce side, the retail order status, just any way we can avoid getting the user to a customer, a service rep, would save the business costs if it built out a lot of flows around this. And now kind of fast forwarding into kind of this generation of devices. So what kind of large manufacturers like Google, Apple, Amazon have done, have built out robotic tools that they essentially have to teach them to understand normal conversations. So I'm sure everyone's kind of worked with Siri or Google Home, Alexa. It's not only a device that lets you ask subjective information, it can have a full-out conversation with you. Whether that be for making reservations or working on kind of different services around like turning on lights, to moving temperature, all of that is kind of adjusted. And as you'll see, kind of the global economic picture is there's certain companies that have really specialized in localization. That's one kind of key thing to the user experience cycle is localizing the user. So we have Google, Amazon, Apple dominating kind of the American market, whereas if we go into international markets, it's other companies. Just given that there's language, accents, dialects that need to be incorporated. So a couple things to kind of look at when we're designing with visual interfaces is that there's a screen that we're designing. In this case, when we're working on voice interfaces, is we have to consider accessibility. A lot of kind of browsers now cater towards screen readers or kind of high contrast, low contrast based reading. Whereas in terms of the voice side, we really have a limited approach of really supporting that. Now it can be a plus to kind of a generation like the elderly where maybe the screen time isn't their biggest factor of their daily life. So we could use kind of examples like there's a service called Life Alert that you can have an elderly person press button when they're either feeling not too well or they've fallen down. Whereas we can kind of take that and apply it to voice to have the same kind of factor come into play, which is they can say, hey, I need help, and then the voice device would come up with services that can help them. And then just looking at screen time, really thinking about how we can use various kind of voice elements to reduce the screen time usage, but increase production. Now, there are a few kind of design challenges that are underlying to using voice only, or motion sensing, or temperature indicators. There is no interface, right? So we have to really use a very well thought out approach of communicating with the user, and I'll kind of dive into how we should design for this. There are really few tactical buttons. The user doesn't have buttons they can press. Maybe at most they have a mute button for privacy, and then maybe some sort of lights to acknowledge understanding. And then there aren't kind of subject matter experts or user experience experts that just specialize in voice as a direct role. It's something that people are kind of converting into. So kind of talking to larger companies, large design teams, what they're having is they have an underlying understanding of user experience, designing for the web interface, the mobile interface, and then we're looking at migrating that designer over to working for voice interfaces. A lot of same concepts, but a little bit different in terms of the device types. So now we're going to jump into the process of what we need to do in terms of designing for an experience that's voice-driven. So we kind of began with research and discovery, very similar to a normal design cycle. Research is a large underlying part of making sure the experience that we're designing is correct. So we want to start with looking at constraints. The internet connection is a huge constraint. We need to make sure the device is either connected to the internet or we have error states designed for if the device isn't connected. To give you kind of a real world example, if you use Alexa and the internet is not connected, they'll re-reference you to ask either an offline question that they can answer without the backend, or it will say, I'm not connected right now, please come back. The other is kind of the speech model quality. So in this case, what we're looking at is what kind of industry we're targeting and how the understanding is. So a lot of devices exist in kind of hospital environments. If you have a voice recognition tool inside a hospital, you have medical jargon, terminology. That dictionary needs to be built in. Or if there's kind of consequences. So for instance, let's say you're designing a UI for a car. We don't want to have certain things that can happen that may cause an issue. So you don't want the user to be able to say, turn off my car. It needs to have some sort of factors where we're reconfirming that before it just does it. So at Codal, what we normally do is we start with a very detailed ecosystem map. So essentially on the top, you'll have all your user types that are involved on the process. And then on the bottom, on the left axis, you'll have all the different user states. So we want to create this ecosystem where we're not only showing the happy path of the successful interaction, but we're also outlining the details of failure states. So an example would be if you're kind of designing and the system does not understand what the user said. We want to make sure we have kind of a negative side. So they'll say, oh, can you please repeat that? Or can we rephrase that? One way to do it is with confirmations. So as the user speaks a certain thing, the system should repeat back, can we please understand what you asked, or reconfirm so the action doesn't get initiated without any sort of flow. Next is we kind of want to go through and define context. So we'll walk through a series of examples, and then we'll look at a real-world example of kind of how we can design and plan these steps. So we'll jump into kind of the what we're designing first. The real-world example here is the Apple TV. So Apple TV has rolled out voice searchability. So in their kind of UX flow, what they've done is they've determined what items they need to confirm with the user, and what items are, or what flows are just ready to go. So for instance, if you press the voice button and said play Batman, the movie would just automatically play. But if you had pressed it and you don't own that movie, they'll actually ask you to say, this is $29.99, would you like to purchase this? Based on that purchase, then the user would get another prompt saying, are you sure you want to purchase it? And then when they click, or when they say yes, it will go through. If the system wasn't able to understand the dialect of the user, or the accent, it would then dictate them to say, use the remote to confirm the purchase. So for everything, we need to really define what are the use cases, and then how we combat that with different types of users. And then speaking of different types of users is who. So what we really want to do is figure out kind of the various personas. In a traditional UX cycle, we figure out personas for usability in terms of device types, the understanding of the user, the technical complexity, the education level. Very similar to that, we want to determine things like localization. Are most of our users coming from a certain part of the world or a certain accent? The other thing is slang and dialect. We want to figure out education level, where they're using the device, and really determine who that person is, and then design independent flows for each person. Next is kind of where. The use case of where is very important. So we have kind of devices like our watch, or like devices that would be in meeting rooms. Very different use case personas. If you have a watch, sometimes you're using it on the go, on the train, outside. So we need to filter for background noise. We need to filter for other sorts of application data that we know. A great example of this is on a device. You can say, change my temperature to 75 degrees. Now, if you're at home, it should pick it up with GPS that you're in the home, so it doesn't need to give you a confirmation. If you're on the road, it should say, okay, updated temperature to 75. So we need to not only use the context of where we're at, but what other device location information we have. And then when is the kind of the next piece where it's very important to see when the user is using this. Kind of the example of using this in a meeting room. A lot of corporate meeting rooms have put in voice devices, so they walk in and say, dial into my 130. They'll automatically call into the conference bridge and start the meeting. Or there's devices that Amazon's rolled out that's kind of your alarm nightstand sidekick, which is waking you up. All of these should have different flows. So for the meeting example, we're looking at maybe just dialing the meeting and then confirming that this is the right meeting, so it's not starting the wrong way. But on the alarm one, you wouldn't want at 6:30 to confirm, can I wake you up at 6:30? It should automatically ring at 6:30. So really looking at different flows based on the location. Next is kind of the why. We need to figure out why people are using this. A lot of cases, we don't want to design something that's creating another hurdle. It should have a positive impact on the experience. You need to either solve a problem or create a solution to something that may not exist already. So like this is a great example of Siri asking, or someone asking Siri to remind them to go on this website afterwards. And it'll remind them at a certain point. The iPhone operates in a couple different ways. It uses a lot of the voice interactions with localization interactions. So if you reject a phone call with Siri, it'll tell you, when should I remind you? 5 minutes, 10 minutes, or when I leave the location. So one big thing is to kind of define why the user's using a certain action, and then use other services to impact that. Next is kind of how. Where is the user, and how are they using it? So one of the cases here is a photo of a car that has kind of Apple CarPlay built in. And it's saying, what can I help you with? And it's trying to make the car a little bit smarter. However, we need to make sure that we're using confirmations where it's needed, and then failed states where it's not. While a user is driving, we should be asking them really simple questions. We don't need to go further into it and ask them a series of repeat questions if they're asking to turn on the radio. Really get specific to, okay, what radio, direct answers. Whereas if it's an offline device, it could be more conversational. And the goal that we have to consider is what are we trying to create here? In this case, we're trying to create more efficient driving. So here's a real-world example of what we kind of do to design the experience map. So we take the what and how of what we're building. So this is, for example, a bot design for a facility that allows you to either pay your bills, ask for balances, ask for open availabilities. And our teams basically will create a key, and then they outline the question and then the various answers. It's very important to test this. So you do a draft one of a flowchart using kind of the popular UX tools. After that, either do a focus group, a client review, send it out to prospective customers that may be using the tool, and they can follow the steps. A lot of times people are asking various questions that we may have answers to, and then there's points that we need to get kind of a live call transfer or to involve someone else into the ecosystem. Next is kind of jumping into the interaction flow. So we'll kind of walk through the process of how a trigger happens all the way to an action. So starting with the triggers, we'll take kind of common world examples so it's easier to follow. So we have two devices like Apple or Google, where you initiate the trigger point of the voice conversation with "Okay Google" or "Hey Siri." Based on that, the system starts recording and understanding what you're trying to say. It's very important to have triggers that are not common speech. Just given you don't want to just automatically start triggers. A little bit of privacy concern, but also you want to make sure the user knows that they're talking to a device at this point. So a lot of devices have buttons involved with them, or if they're a motion sensor when you're close to it, it'll start a trigger. We need to kind of define which is the best trigger for the solution we're building. And then having a response, so the user knows that the trigger is worked. So rather that be a light, color, sound, just some sort of event that happens from the device that they know that someone is listening. And then post that, what we want to make sure is that we're repeating the user's interaction. So if they're asking for what happened to the 85 Chicago Bears, we want to make sure that they're kind of rephrasing that question before we answer it. So this way the user has a few seconds to say, wait, stop, that's not what I'm looking for, or to recorrect their question before we use kind of computing power in the background to figure out what the answer is. So in terms of designing, what we want to do is make it really immediate, brief. We don't want to have a full sentence for a trigger point or things like that. And then typically want to pick words that are common across multiple languages. A lot of people have made up words. There's a lot of segments that we have to follow to make sure that it's working kind of globally if the product is global, or locally if it's a localized environment. And then a very clear beginning. lot of privacy concerns you see on the news of people having devices listen or recordings of audio. We want to make sure we're really concise on when it's being recorded to when it's being recorded. The next step is really kind of focusing on feedback. So on a traditional UX cycle, we have a lot of different feedback elements. So if you submit a form, you get an email. If you sign up for an account, you get an email. If you move something to a trash can, there's a sound effect to it. There's a pop-up, there's push notifications, text messages that go out based on actions. In a voice interface, we really don't have any of that screen real estate. So what we really need to do is figure out what actions we can work with. So repeating back to the user what they're asking, and then restating the question, asking for feedback within the voice cycle. So if someone says, turn on my lights, the lights will turn on in your home, and then saying, are these the correct lights? Once you kind of engage and learn the user, then you can stop asking repeat feedback questions. But the idea is to become very smart so we can help the user at a quicker rate than using the device. And then the ending cue. So after the sequence is complete, let's say it's turning on the lights, we want to make sure we're giving them enough time to respond before we stop recording. Usually most devices and most kind of UX cycles control this based on expected responses. So if you're asking, what is my bank balance, and it's responding $5,000, we kind of know how long that would take for a user to process that data. So they can ask a counter question. What was my last updated transaction? Or what are my pending deposits? We want to kind of give them that enough time to process the data and then come up with an answer. And that kind of goes into reasonably pausing. For each use case in our kind of flow charts that we design, we put in reasonable time. So rather that be 15 seconds for someone to know something or a little bit longer. So that's really done with user testing. We really want to have enough focus groups and tests to see how they interact and then tweak that data over time. So then jumping into the next set is injecting humanity. So really putting in the human touch to the experience. There's a lot of different ways that people behave, have accents, where they're located. All of these kind of make a quite an impact to how we're talking. So I have a little demo here from Google and how they've kind of adapted to injecting humanity to the Google Home. Play this here. I think the audio works here. Yeah, I'm sure you can see.
How long is the wait?
So we'll just go.
You?
Hi, I'd like to know the table for Wednesday the 7th.
For 7 people?
It's for 4 people.
4 people? When?
Next
Right?
Wednesday at 6 p.m.
Oh, actually, we need to go like after like 5 people. 4 people you can come.
How long is the wait usually to be seated?
When tomorrow or weekday or?
For next Wednesday, the 7th.
Oh no, it's not too busy. You can come for 4 people, okay?
Oh, I gotcha. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
So as you see, there's a level of kind of human interaction that you have to account for. So this is really done by repeated testing. So as we go back and look at the flows that we design, we can look at kind of various elements of how people are behaving, what the responses are. And then as you see on the left side, that was Google. They really catered it towards the user. The end user had no idea I was talking to a voice interface.
Hi, I'd like to know the table for would they be better?
So jumping into testing. So everything in user experience design is really driven around user testing, research, and really coming up with how we can connect with users. So testing is great internally with your own design teams, your product managers, but really working with real users is where we figure out how people behave. So really going and catering to kind of a target audience that we're designing for and doing blind tests, voice interaction tests, and these can really be done via phone calls. You don't need to have in person, given that it's all supposed to be done without visually kind of interacting with tools. The very important part is to test the fallbacks, the fail states. So traditionally, when user experience designers design things, they're assuming that there's a clean path to completion. They're not designing like the Google example where there's fail states. The user doesn't understand, the device doesn't understand. We really need to make sure that we have a proper mode of kind of interaction, that if you fail at understanding the service or you don't understand the quality of work, we need to make sure that we can re-ask that question and come up with a state. And then the biggest thing of any sort of design experience is it solving a problem? Is it creating a solution? A lot of things exist out there that are just simply, it's a cool thing. People aren't coming back to using it again and again. They're using it just to test it. We really need to make sure that there's an attraction point, and then there's a problem that's being solved with that user experience. So kind of overall recaps, user interfaces are really growing. Now that you see it pretty much in every aspect of home automation, to your car, to very complex use cases like we're looking at. Hospitals and surgeons are using it while they're dressed up for surgery and they need to get information on the patient. They're communicating with the voice bot, all the way down to kind of just a bunch of startups kind of innovating ability to communicate via voice with things that we may never have done so. The large portion is to understand the user and what we're building. So things from testing, how we operate, who we're looking at, the area, the language, the device types. Typically what people do is they design an experience flow, and then they adapt it to multiple devices. So you're kind of adapting to a larger broad of users. And then understanding the larger ecosystem. So just because there's voice involved, there's other data that we have. So there's device data. So we can have information on someone's computer or someone's iPhone or Android phone. So we know that info. So we may be able to look at it and say, oh, we know their location, we know they're logged into Facebook, we know they're busy at 6 p.m. on Tuesday. We can take all of that data and then refactor it into our flow. So we can be more intelligent than the user and may already know their answer before we have to process that data. Before building anything, we really need to make sure we have a proper matrix of information. We need to know what are the risks. Are there a lot of different users? Is the use case going to be offline? Really just figuring out all of those aspects, outlining that, and then designing for that. And then focusing on the test failed states. The large component of users are really looking at things that aren't met. They may say turn on the lights, but they don't realize that this device doesn't have their light system connected to it. So we have to kind of have to use tutorials and guides to make the user really feel comfortable using the device, but then also having failed states and actions for them to correct that. And then last is kind of looking at user types and locations. We really want to focus on a small micro user type and location and expand upon it. That Google example, the Google team had worked on that for about 2 years. They started with localization in certain areas, certain industries, like restaurants and hospitals, and then they expanded out. It's really a test-driven process. And you can't jump to every single solution right away. Open up for questions.
Standards around transparency. I'd like to know if I'm talking remember when that demo came out, right? I mean, they specifically have the localization
Absolutely.
and things
Yeah.
deliberately for you. Is there a feeling or a standard?
So it's really not standardized governmentally in a sense, but in terms of users, what they do, or designers, they will predictate that you're talking to an automated engine. Typically, like American Express has a similar tool. What they're doing is they're prefacing it, saying this is Alexa calling. But from a part of experience design, they're trying to eliminate that so people don't just skip the robot to a real person. So yeah, it's kind of a 50-50, but I do think in certain situations you definitely want to know you're talking to a robot versus not. Like in the healthcare space, you may not take the opinion 100% and move forward. You may want to know that this is not a real physician calling, it's a robot.
Similar question around that industry. Are there industry standards or best practices around when that has to stop, by which point it has to stop, or are there loopholes where a company could have a poor communication into people's personal conversations for like 5 minutes after
Yeah.
the
People have kind of allowed this in their settings to say how long they can listen. So like for example, Google and Alexa in your app, you can say keep listening or deactivate after X minutes or seconds. I think it's on the design team and the engineering team to let the user know that and then also allow them to modify that. There's no kind of ending queue system that we've ran into in that sense. I think a large portion is understanding how you're ending. If you're ending if someone asks you the weather and you say it's going to be 50 degrees, it should end right there. But if you're asking a counter question, maybe leaving a light on or a blinker on until the user knows. But heavily unregulated, it does create a lot of recordings that people don't need. You see that on the news all the time where you'll see Alexa recorded a full conversation and so on.
There's another, when it comes to the trigger words, you use the little words that they call it, when it comes to the wait for it, you actually have it. Why isn't it one person? We kind of a little bit of stuff with like 4 wait words for Google.
Correct.
Computer, something like that. Why would you actually personalize it to actually be locked for all the users?
Yeah, so a large portion of that is with the engineering cycle. So what they do is all of these brands, they have voice training kits. So they've spent a lot of time on kind of voice recognition and the process of how it processes that data. And then from a perspective of disclosures, they have 4 words or 6 words that you can use. I think a little bit of it's with security, so you don't end up not knowing that you're communicating with the device. And then the other side is just recognition. The accents, the dialects, the various components, so they're limiting it down. I know at one point Amazon experimented, train the word that you're using, but they backed away. I think it kind of blends between a little bit of marketing and people knowing that you're using Alexa versus just letting you name what you want.
We were discussing earlier that I'm not lost here when it's a device. That's the way it works.
Yeah.
So so you kind of already know the word that you have to
So, anything else?
Yeah, kind of on that, how are like security standards for like, I know like Google uses voice recognition, so it knows I'm talking to it or you're talking to it. I guess it's the easy to the recording, so I gotta make sure that someone like doesn't record me saying, hey Google, lock my doors. So you can bring the smart lock player to do things.
Yeah.
How do you
So
like guidelines on that? Like, what's too much to allow for
yeah.
the system to do?
Not too many guidelines, but as you're designing the flow, you can say that, okay, you're saying unlock my doors, but your physical device that's associated with your account isn't near that. So it does double confirmation or will ask you via push notification. So that's that part where I spoke about kind of alerting the user and triggering it. So certain actions, we should definitely trigger the user on a different device or a different tool to let them know that this is happening. Right? If I say turn off my ADT home security, it should know that, okay, I'm 500 miles away, it should reconfirm that. Or you can also do kind of voice passwords. So a lot of brands have kind of set up asking security questions that you would do in like an email service or kind of two-factor where you would only know the answer. And that kind of goes into the onboarding flow of this project.
You have the ones that show different UIs outside of the different how that
Yeah.
is actually saturated with either Google or something.
Correct.
So it's kind of wondering how are other countries actually handling this use of video.
So I think a lot of countries are operating it in a different way. A lot of countries have censorship regulations that you run into, like the UAE or China, where there's certain things that you can't ask, certain things you can't ask. So a lot of globalization elements there. The other countries, like in the European Union, they have something called the GDPR regulations of what you can store and what you can't. So it's interesting to see the adoption. A lot of them do require double opt-in. So after you ask a question or re-ask a question, they have to confirm. Reduces the user experience quality, but there's just governmental requirements there. So I think you see a little bit of drop in adoption in those countries or those areas. In the US, it's pretty unregulated, so you see kind of a higher expansion on that.
Another obvious question: why is Amazon Google for a while on search? When it comes to voice search, Amazon has that away from that. How is Amazon come out to like it's so far ahead about Google?
I think they came to the market quicker. They had a service called Lex, which is basically just a voice kit and an AI kit or a robot kit that understands different commands, text-based, audio, video-based. They have a lot of different devices that they've rolled out. You kind of see Google catching up into that as well with the new home tablets and the home centers. But I think it's just kind of an equal race in terms of how they work. The benefit of the UX designer end on that is you can design an experience that's very easily for engineering teams to adapt it on both sides. So it can be almost like a Google, Apple kind of battle on the phones. Yeah.
Is there any standards? Is there any standard body?
So all kind of major companies have, if you go to their kind of developer design kits, they have kind of standards kits. So what they've done is they call it toolboxes. So like Amazon has the Lex toolbox, Google has the Google toolbox. And they've kind of defined how and what data should be able to be over voice and process. No governmental standards necessarily in the US. I'm sure we'll achieve that at some point. But it's really kind of governed by the user, and then I'm sure the privacy policy and the terms of uses kick into a lot. Yeah, we at least we haven't came across working with any major Cortana-based devices. It's primarily more, at least in my opinion, it's more driven towards action items. It's not more like cognitive learning or conversational. It's like you can have it turn on your music on your computer by just clicking the button or facilitate that individual trailing behind. I'm sure the use case is pretty high since it's pre-deployed on like Xbox or Microsoft devices. But the flow of design for that would be pretty similar. Any other questions? Thoughts? Good. If anything else comes up that you have questions, there's contact information here. Happy to answer, collaborate on anything.